2 blog posts ago, there was one about this phenomenon called pareidolia. And I didn't know what that word meant, but I saw something in our local, well, SF Gate, the San Francisco Chronicle's online portal, free portal for news. And it was talking about the night watchers. And this is not Rembrandt, although maybe the title comes from that, but it's about this phenomenon in Big Sur where people claim that they have seen shadowy figures in a cape and a kind of cowboy, not a conventional cowboy hat, but a wide brimmed hat, like almost like a Spanish hat, that they've seen these figures in twilight, but when they approach them, they vanish. And so there's been a discussion recently is, are these figures, real, or are they phenomenon of atmospheric conditions? And there's a lot of fog in Big Sur, like there is all along the California coast, and there's tall, steep ridge lines. And the effect of that is that you get conditions where there's fog flowing over ridges and the sun at low angles. And so you can get magnification and long projection of shadows. And so this is perhaps an attempt to explain, why people might see these things. And it turns out it's not that old a legend. It's only come from the mid-1900s when people like Henry Miller and such were wandering, Robinson Jeffers wandering around Big Sur. And so who knows, maybe it was a modern legend created to create intrigue for tourists or something. It's not like it goes back to Native American, although people tried to connect it to them, but that's unprovable. But it brought up this concept of pareidolia, which is seeing what isn't there. And this is, I realized that, this is key to art, because you start with a blank canvas and you usually don't want to end up with that. So you have to see what isn't there. And
I like that.
How you do this, that you actually cultivate pareidolia rather than, the night watchers, while people saw something and then they decide, wow, these are shadowy figures that somehow inhabit the wild and steep coast range of Big Sur. But pareidolia in art is something that you actually, techniques that Nancy teaches that I don't know so much about, like activating the canvas and, bringing a piece of canvas alive and starting the process of animating it is a kind of pareidolia. And we often joke that there are certain kinds of, pareidolia is sometimes classified as a mental illness, to see what is there, hallucination, I guess. A
visual hallucination?
Visual hallucination, in extreme cases it is. But sometimes pareidolia is milder than that. And we joke that there are certain forms of mental illness that are socially acceptable. And that includes mathematics, which is me, and music, which is both of us, and art, which is Nancy. That they are both they're all distortions of reality of a kind that other people often find pleasing. And so this is kind of a housebroken version of mental illness.
Well, you've got to go to that edge. And what's interesting when you're talking about visual hallucinations, and really that's associated with delirium.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And it's like, I think as creators, whether you're going into mathematical equations, or you're composing music, or you're composing paintings or whatever, you got to go to that edge, and that is almost a sort of delirium, right? Like you said, you're seeing things that aren't there. You are literally bringing them to life, whatever that is. Right.
So I saw this article about pareidolia and the Big Sur night watchers in our local paper. And I don't know who said this. When in doubt, there's one of two people I reach out to. It's either Richard Feynman, the physicist, or it's Mark Twain, the writer. It's got to be one of those two if it's really good. But somebody said, it may have been one of those two, that anything studied in sufficient detail becomes interesting. And so I saw this thing in the paper and I thought, night watchers, pareidolia, if I dig into this long enough, it will become interesting. And it did, and there became a connection to art.
Yeah, and you just never know what those connections will be, right?
Right, you have to just start with the confidence that you will find them. It's like going in a multiply connected landscape, a place where there's many trails, that all meet and converge many, many times. And so it doesn't matter too much which direction you head out at first, that you will run into many junctions and that there will be many options. And, I had no idea how, it was getting close to time to publish this, and I had no idea if Pareidolia and the Night Watchers were going to be fruitful or not, but I just kept on going.
Yeah.
And it became interesting, and it became connected to art.
Yeah. And you just never know. And so you've got one foot in the known and one foot in the unknown. And you're moving into whatever is unfolding, right? And you don't know how that's going to go. Just like when we go into some work and we don't know how this is going to turn out. And we may love it and we may not. And I submit to you that that piece, which is we may not love it, is so important. It's so important. Okay. I was listening to a guy who's being interviewed, who's a writer. He's a prolific writer. And he said that he writes and writes and writes and writes and writes and writes more. And much of it, in some ways, doesn't see the light of day in terms of being published. But all of that is so important. It's part of the process, and it informs whatever you put out there in the world. And so I believe that, learning to not only tolerate, but actually embrace the ugly, the unfamiliar, the edgy, the off the wall is so important, because that's where the juice is. That's where the magic is. That's where the innovation lives.